Hi there, how's it going? Andrew here with another edition of the Creative Endeavour podcast. In this episode, I'm talking to Virgil Elliott, who has to be a modern authority when it comes to traditional oil painting. In fact, he wrote the book on it called Traditional Oil Painting. This is one of my favorite books to refer to in the studio. He also has a Facebook page by the same title, where he openly shares his information when it comes to making pictures. And it becomes really handy when we have specific questions about layering mediums, varnishing, or what will make our pictures last a really long time. Now, this conversation with Virgil was really fascinating. We got into a little bit of our views on modern art, and then we moved into some more technical territory and talked about what makes paintings last a long time, and even got into some of those techniques that the old masters used. Now, I recorded this conversation using Skype, so please excuse some bumps along the way. There was a bit of a reverberation and some feedback when it came to the audio, but still, we were able to manage through and have a great conversation. I really hope you enjoy this episode of the Creative Endeavour. Here's Virgil Elliott. Well, Virgil Elliott, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. It's a pleasure to meet you, sir.
Well, it's nice to meet you too, Andrew, and I appreciate the plug you gave for my book, even though the book is not currently in print.
No worries. Well, look, I'm looking forward to it being available very, very soon. I know you're sorting that out. But look, I wanted to just refer to the book here just as we're getting started, because I think the first paragraph that you've written here, and I would like to read this just for my viewers and listeners here, because I think it kind of sums up or sets the groundwork for what I want to ask you about and what we're talking about. So if you don't mind me just kind of repeating this back to you, and just for the sake of the listeners as well. So in the introduction, where you start off, in most large cities in the United States and Europe, there's at least one art museum in which can be seen firsthand oil paintings executed in centuries past by some of the greatest artists who have ever lived. Upon viewing the best of these paintings, no one who has ever tried to paint can help but experience a profound sense of awe. Now, that is something that I think just kind of that feeling of awe, just looking at these old masters' works and just being completely transfixed and completely moved by them, is something that I experience when I go and look at this original work in particularly 19th century collections. But I find kind of modern day paintings and for the most part seem to be lacking. Do you think we're missing something in today's art world, in particular in painting?
Well, it depends on who you mean by we. And also by today's art world. The art world that gets the most publicity, yes, it's missing a lot and lacking a lot, and it's backwards in, to me, it seems like it's backwards in every way. It seems, but I don't know if that's the art world that you intend, or the one that's re-emerging from that, or in spite of that.
Well, let's go with that, because I mean, my listeners will probably know by now that I have a little bit of a disdain for modern art. But what's your take on the state of the art world today in terms of academic modern art?
I'm seeing some very slow improvements. I remember in about it must have been 1951 or 52, I was reading on the cover of Life magazine a big article about a guy they called Jack the Dripper, and I refuse to mention his name beyond that. And he was a guy on a ladder with a can of paint and a stick, and he was throwing it onto canvases that were laid on the floor, and he was being proclaimed as a genius. And I thought, I was a very young child at that time. I thought I must have been, 6 or 7 years old. And I thought, this is so ridiculous. I don't need to pay any attention to it at all. I was already committed to be an artist. I started drawing when I was 2 years old and was serious from the very first day. And so my thought was, I don't need to pay any attention to this, because people will realize how ridiculous it is. By the time I'm an adult, it will have all blown over, and no one will be interested in it anymore. I will simply concentrate on learning to draw as well as I can, and when I can draw well, then I will learn to paint as well as I can, and I'll be able to have a good career as an adult. Now, mind you, this was the early 1950s when I said this, and now it's what, 60 something years later, and it's just now starting to happen a little bit. So my cynicism regarding human intelligence was affected by this, as you it seems reasonable to me, and so I'm happy to see it happening while I'm still alive. But I was a small child when I had that thought, and I still have that thought, and I'm an old man now. And people are starting to finally get tired of being fed a lot of foolishness and told that they're supposed to like it, otherwise they're intellectually deficient. And that, of course, it plays to people's securities over their own intellectual standing, and that accounts for the popularity of that stuff, in my opinion. There has never been any reason for the great artworks that were ever painted, the greatest paintings ever created, the greatest sculptures ever created, to have such an extensive world of rhetoric to convince people that it's good, because people can look at great art and be inspired by it, by the artwork itself, what it tells them. If somebody else has to tell people that something is good, that their own natural sense of quality does not tell them is good, they do and should become skeptical of the people who are trying to sell them something that looks like there's nothing there that's worth their attention. So these are some of my thoughts on that sort of thing. And frankly, I think it's been discussed so much that I don't see any great point in continuing to discuss it, frankly, because that sort of thing thrives on negative feedback. When people say something about modern art and any of its various subphyla and aberrations, they become, if they're critical of it in any way, they get labeled as being people who just don't understand, or not part of the intellectual elite, the hip, cool in crowd that has these specially highly refined sensibilities to be able to see the finer qualities that the rest of us stupid fools can't recognize. It plays right into their hands to talk about how bad it is. So I don't really want to talk about it at all. I don't want to mention those people's names or waste any time discussing them, because frankly, I don't think they're worth discussion ever. They weren't ever, and they're still not. And I'd just rather everybody forgot about them. When the subject comes up, what I say is that was a 20th century phenomenon. Whether we like it or don't like it, it's not the 20th century anymore. And the art world tends to acknowledge things century by century. That's something from the last century. And people who advocate that sort of thing are stuck in their last century. There's one good thought that came out of that whole thing in the last century. And now I'm turning it around on them. And that thought was, it is valid and legitimate to reject the premises of previous centuries. So I am rejecting the premises of the 20th century. And all the criticisms they had of work from previous centuries prior to the 20th century now is turned around on them. It's no longer valid. It's passé. It's old-fashioned. All it ever had going for it in the first place was novelty. And that novelty was a temporary virtue if you recognize it as a virtue at all, and it's gone now. And there's nothing left of value. There's nothing there that will inspire people on its own terms without a sideshow barker there telling them that they're ignorant fools if they don't like it.
Well,
sorry, I got off on a tirade there. I would have rather not had to talk about that stuff at all, but you asked me what my feelings are, and that's it.
I'm afraid they reflect my sentiments exactly.
Then you have good taste.
I appreciate what you're saying, but you raised a few things in there. So let's move away from that subject then, and we'll move on to
certainly
what actually makes great art. What is it about painting? What is it about art that is great art? It just seems to be timeless. But in your opinion, what are those factors that make, great timeless works of art?
Well, I don't think those factors can be done justice verbally, quite frankly. If they could, we wouldn't need to paint. But the greatest artists have always understood what of the elements within their power to control elicit certain psychological responses in the minds of the viewers. And just as musicians need to understand this, or composers of music need to understand, there are certain patterns, intervals, colors, and sounds that the human brain responds to favorably. And these are not things, maybe they're things that can be quantified verbally. I don't think there are, and I would really not encourage people to pursue it from that perspective, because that would render them somewhat irrelevant. We have to recognize that there are limits to written and spoken language. There are things that cannot be expressed with words. Words have their limitations. And this is where art begins, where literature leaves off, where spoken and written communication leaves off. It's a visual world. As somebody said one time that talking about art is like dancing about architecture. So I don't think that words can do art justice. But there are color patterns that we recognize, or color schemes that we recognize as harmonious, and for whatever reasons, probably having their origin in survival instincts from our ancestors long ago. That's just conjecture on my part. But there are certain patterns of light, certain distributions of shapes, certain types of shapes that we find more visually pleasing. And in music, there are certain tones that we find pleasing, certain tones that we find displeasing. And composers of music understand that you have to have a dominant theme, and you have to have a certain amount of opposition to that dominant theme in order to generate interest. But the opposition must ultimately resolve in favor of the dominant theme. This is something that, I'm a musician also, this is something that plays into visual art as well. We have a dominant, we choose artists, we're basically orchestrating the elements visually, just the way a composer of music orchestrates the instruments at his disposal. We do that also with visual art. And so we realize our picture should have a certain range of values. Now, what is the impact that we want to make? Do we want to make a dramatic impression? Then we would go with extreme chiaroscuro, like Caravaggio, like Rembrandt, like Ribera, et cetera, et cetera. Or if we want a calmer mood to be generated, then maybe we will look at a more compressed range of values, and we'll go with a different kind of lighting, similar to William Bouguereau, similar to Vermeer. It depends on the mood we want to create. And we realize that certain colors elicit certain psychological responses, and we choose the colors that will help us express what it is that we want to express. And the best artists have always understood these things. There's an insight that develops as we're learning to draw and learning to paint, that basically, and looking at great works of art is the way really to develop these sensibilities and to gain an understanding of them. So we're lucky today that we have access to many more images than people of previous centuries did. This is one thing that I don't object to about modern technology in the modern world. We're able to travel to cities where there are great art museums, and we're able to see great paintings that were done hundreds of years ago. And we get to see a lot more of them than people of Rembrandt's time got to see. Rembrandt never left Holland, so far as we know. He never even went to Italy. Most artists at least went to Italy to see the works of the Italian masters from the Renaissance. But so far as we know, Rembrandt never did leave Holland. He got to see the works of other artists whose works were on exhibit in Holland, and he bought some of them himself he owned some works by Titian, as I understand it. He bought them at auction. And so we have that advantage, and we can develop those sensibilities if we dedicate enough effort to it. But we have to travel. We shouldn't just limit ourselves to looking at artworks in reproduction, because reproductions always suffer. Looking at the artworks full scale, the size that they were actually created, and seeing them with our own eyes rather than through the eyes of a camera, we will see things the camera will miss. We will see things differently than the way the camera does, because the camera is constructed differently from the human viewing apparatus. Our viewing apparatus consists of two eyes connected to a brain. The brain plays a part in this. It has an editing function. The camera doesn't have that. The camera records it's a mechanical thing, and it's only got one eye, and its eye is flat in the back. Our eyes are rounded in the back. So there's distortion whenever there's a camera involved. So looking at the works of the great masters in the museums is the best way to develop these sensibilities, along with many years spent practicing drawing and learning to paint after one is good at drawing.
Right.
So I am rambling on, and I think I've forgotten what the original question was.
Well, it was another silly question. My first question was in regards to so far I'm 2 for 2 of bad questions, Virgil. So, but I love where you go with these things, guys. The original question was all about are we missing something when we look at art of today? Or no, it's beg your pardon. What makes great art? What makes great art?
Yes, okay. Thank you for reminding me.
And then, but I love that. You know what? I'm going to use that from now on. Talking about art is like dancing about architecture. That is brilliant.
Well, it's not original with me. I got it from someone else, and I don't remember who it was or where. Well, chances are, whoever I heard it from someone else too. It's one of those folk sayings, I guess.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Look, let's talk a little bit about you personally, if you don't mind, because
gosh.
Yeah. Look,
you may regret asking.
Well, I know a little bit about you. Obviously, I have your book, beautiful book, fantastic presentation, full of knowledge. I mean, I thought I knew what I was doing and what I was talking about. And upon reading this, there was just so much background that I just didn't have, and it caused me to have even more questions. And it really got the cogs turning, so to speak. And so brilliant work there. But
tell me more.
You're a fantastic painter as well. As a great writer. But predominantly, you're an artist. You're a self-employed, practicing professional artist. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
So, do you exhibit your work? Where do you show your work? And talk us through your practice a little bit.
Well, I'm not showing my work anymore, at least for the time being. I'm not in galleries anymore. Collectors come to me directly now. So I've been in many galleries over the decades, and I've had good experiences with some of them and bad experiences with some of them. But as things stand right now, I'm not strongly motivated to be in the galleries, and I haven't entered competitions for a while. I'm getting most of my art income these days is from portrait commissions.
Wow.
Or commissions for paintings of my own ideas. And I'm always happy when I get a commission of that nature, because there's one very astute collector who asked me to describe to him what paintings I had in mind that I wanted to do of my own ideas. And I described several to him, and he chose one, and he said, I'll commission you to paint that one. So I love it when that happens. It's probably the ideal situation for an artist. But I get hired to paint portraits of people's families and so on, and those are what I consider my pot boilers. There's that term in art, pot boilers, and that's what artists paint in order to keep something boiling in their soup pot, to so to speak. And so portrait commissions are my pot boilers, and I get paid well enough today for my portraits that buys me enough time to work on the other paintings that are my own ideas. And if I live long enough, maybe I'll get them all painted. I'm an old man now, and if I can live another 100 years, I'll probably get them all done.
That's
I'm working on that.
brilliant, brilliant. Look, because yeah, I mean, from you describing that, it sounds like an ideal situation for somebody starting out, just about to embark on their artistic career, and just looking at that as a long term kind of vision. They might be asking from this position, how on earth do I even get to that place where Virgil is now? That would be a dream come true. How did you start? Like, where did you begin this journey? With art
Well,
school or?
I've done many other things to earn money before I got in a position where I could earn enough as an artist to not have to do other things. I've had other businesses of my own that were less intellectually challenging than creating artwork. But I was always doing artwork and pursuing my art career in the meantime. I used to do commercial art long ago, but I've had all sorts of jobs. When I was in my 20s, after I got out of the Army, for a while I worked as an iron worker. I've had a bunch of crummy jobs. I never considered any of them permanent. They were just something to do to pay my bills, and I was always drawing and continuing to refine my abilities as an artist. But when I was young, the art world was different somewhat from what it is now. When I got out of the Army, I was 21 years old. I was already a pretty good painter, not as good as I am now, but I was a good draftsman. And I just signed up for college art classes thinking, maybe there's somebody there that can help me become a better artist than I already am. That was a mistake. But I went to art galleries and I showed them my paintings and drawings. And they said to me, this was, 1966. They said to me, we are not interested in anybody who draws or paints realistically now. Furthermore, we're not interested in young artists. Any artist under the age of 60 has not yet reached his artistic maturity. And so, and I looked younger than I was. When I was 21 years old, 22 years old, I looked like I was about 18 or 17 or something like that. So that worked against me for most of my life until my beard turned prematurely gray at the age of 72 or something like that. But anyway, so I had to do other things for a living for a long time. But I started doing commercial art as one of my sidelines. I did it freelance, small time in, starting around 1976. Now, while I was, earlier than that, occasionally I would sell a drawing or a painting, usually drawings. I wasn't doing much painting at that time. I thought I would just concentrate on drawing for another 10 years before I got back into painting. I had painted one painting that disappointed me after I got out of the Army. I painted quite well while I was in the Army, but after I got out, I tried acrylics. I had always done my best work in oils. And when I tried acrylics, I was dissatisfied with the results of that painting. And I told myself, okay, I can't paint as well as I thought I could. I need to just concentrate on drawing for the next 10 years. And my main medium for that 10 years is going to be pen and ink, where you cannot erase, you cannot correct. And so I sentenced myself to 10 years of drawing with pen and ink before I would get back to painting.
Wow.
It turns out that was unnecessary. But I think I did benefit something from it, because 10 years later, I started doing commercial art. And so I was painting again. And I found that I was painting better than before. But those years of drawing did benefit me. I was already a good draftsman before that, though. So it might have been overkill to make it 10 years. But anyway, I found that I could paint as well as or better than before when I got back to it. And the commercial art projects brought me to the attention to some people who would buy paintings from me or commission me to do paintings. One thing led to another. And by 1982, I thought I should enter competitions I felt that I was ready. I was confident enough at that time that my work was good enough to start promoting myself as a fine artist. I quit doing commercial art around that time. And I started winning awards and art shows and coming to the attention of people. And then they said, please, we want to take lessons from you. And so then I started teaching art. One thing led to another. But all during that time, I had other ways of earning money too. Like I said, I'm a musician. From time to time, I earned a little bit of money, never very much, as a musician. I had another business in a construction-related field. I became very good at that in a short amount of time. It just started out as a part-time job, but I got good at it, and I became, in demand for my services in that capacity. I'm versatile. I know how to do a lot of things. I used to work in a motorcycle shop a long time ago where we did metal fabrication, building custom motorcycles, and that's something I enjoy doing. It's a creative endeavor as well. But for young people wanting to make success as an artist, I guess the best piece of advice that I can give them is make sure you've got some other source of income, because there's no guarantee that you'll ever be able to make a good living as an artist, no matter how good you get. And if it happens, and it happens when you're in your 50s or 60s or 70s, you'll have to somehow survive your 20s, 30s, and 40s before you'll get there. You'll have to be able to feed yourself. And this is not a new situation. I mean, artists all through time have had help. And Rembrandt married a wealthy woman. And I regard Rembrandt as possibly the greatest artist that ever lived. But he was greatly helped by marrying a wealthy woman. Leonardo da Vinci's father was wealthy. John Singer Sargent, his parents were wealthy. Corot was wealthy. Edgar Degas came from a wealthy family. Edouard Manet also. It's a real disadvantage to have to come from a family where there is no money to help a person and, an artist to pursue art single-mindedly. It's a struggle. It is a struggle. And in the future, people that are young now may find it to be even more of a struggle, because now there are these academies and ateliers, or academies that call themselves ateliers, who are turning out some very, very well-trained students, and they're young, and they're all in competition with one another for every opportunity that's out there. And so the competition is going to be very, very stiff. And whatever contribution my book made to that, it's made things more difficult for me too, because now I've got more competition than I did before. And now the focus of the art buying world is on young artists, and somehow or another, I'm not considered young anymore.
Oh, Virgil, come on. You're still relevant, right?
Well, I'm happy that I'm able to make a living as an artist. I'm not getting wealthy doing it, but I'm able to pay my bills, and I'm not complaining. I'm doing probably as well as or better than I ever have. I've gone through periods in my life where I was making enough money as an artist to live reasonably well, and then a recession would come along and yank the rug out from under me and destroy all my opportunities, and then I would be, struggling to survive and get through. And fortunately, knowing how to paint portraits was a very important factor in my survival. And so this is something I'll encourage every art student and every aspiring young artist to do, is learn how to do portraits. There will always be a demand for portraits by somebody who's able to do them well. And so, people don't hire abstract expressionists to paint their portraits. That's when they have to look for somebody who actually is an artist and actually knows how to paint. So even if a person's greatest interest might be still life painting, landscape painting, figure painting, whatever, it's worthwhile to learn how to do portraits and learn how to do them very well. And it is the most challenging thing that an artist can become involved in, but it's worthwhile. And many of the great artists throughout history made most of their living by painting commissioned portraits. Rembrandt, on and on and on. I don't need to name them all. Peter Paul Rubens,
Absolutely.
Sargent. So there's no disgrace in painting commissions.
Well, on
There's
that
a
note, it's
long line of precedents for that.
yeah. I kind of I had a situation that I just wanted to mention, though, to just again reflect what you're saying there. I was called by a particularly wealthy client, and I paint portraits as well, which is a great supplement to the income. I can't use them for teaching or printing or use them in my YouTube videos, but I sell directly to people who like to buy them. But I had this one opportunity to have a sitting with this very wealthy woman, and she lived in Melbourne in Australia. I flew across, and I was looking at her art collection, and they were all modern abstract expressionist paintings. And I suddenly had this thought, like, what am I doing here? What am I doing? Have you not seen my work? I mean, you know me, you know what I do. What am I doing here? And she said, well, I'm not going to get one of these people to paint my portrait, am I? I'm like, oh well, I suppose not. You want it to look like you, so here we go. And I'm very much from that school of thought. Although I must admit my technique does need some work and refinement, but I'm from that school of thought that, I want to bring out the sitter. I want the viewer to feel like that person is actually there. So maybe they're viewing it 60, 70 years in the future, and that person is long gone. But in that moment that you're looking, you feel this moment of this personal connection with the subject and the painting. And so what you say, I think, is really sound advice. Learning how to paint portraits and paint them well, there will be a market. I just want to mention something else, though, in regards to what you said, because I too have been affected by these recessions that come and go, and when that rug is yanked out from under us, there are still people at the end of the day who have got the money. There are some people, like, it's just, all I see it as is a recession is, yeah, it sucks for the little guys and people like me, and the rug does get yanked out, but it's just a transfer of wealth from one person to another. So if you have something, some sort of skill or something to offer that is valuable or desirable to somebody with means, then you're going to find yourself in employment. So look, from here, I have a lot of people asking me, Virgil, about education and learning techniques and hey, what art school did you go to? Because I want to go there. And I'm thinking, no, don't do it. Don't do it. I've got my feelings about art school and art education, but what's your personal feeling? And maybe what should people look for or watch out for if they're considering art school?
Don't look to the university system and the colleges for art education. Look to academies that are they're specialized in art. There might be some good art instructors. I'm sure there are in some colleges and universities who are competent artists. But to go through the entire program that's specified in order to get a degree in the university system, the college system, invariably a student is going to be subjected to some sort of brainwashing, some indoctrination that is harmful to his or her development as an artist. And it's very disappointing. I have had experiences where I had students who wanted to study with me full time, and I just couldn't devote full time to teaching because I'm primarily an artist. And I will help people as much as I can and make sacrifices to help them. But, I had a student years ago who, very promising young man, who wanted to study full time and wanted me to recommend a school. And so I had heard good things about a particular school whose name I don't want to mention now because it worked out badly. I recommended that I told him I had heard good things about this particular school. And if he wanted a letter of recommendation to get him in the school, I would write that letter. And he did. And he got in that school and he studied there. And I told him, before you go, understand that there's going to be people there who will give you a very persuasive sounding bunch of rhetoric that you should not listen to because it will interfere with your development as an artist. It may completely cancel it. And well, frankly, that's what ended up happening, as far as I could tell. And this young man he had talent, he had tremendous potential. He could have been, a great master, I think, if he had just studied with the right people. But he listened to the wrong people. They told him that what was bad was good and what was good was bad. And it's very hard for a young person who is, impressionable to resist that sort of thing when it's coming from a college professor. We think professors are smart people. If they say this is good, they're probably right because they're smart people. These are representatives of the intellectual elite. And so, the tendency for a young person is to place greater credence in the word of a professor who works in a college than is really warranted. So the places I would recommend people to go to study, if they can find a good artist to study with, an artist who has an academy, Michael John Angel at the Angel Academy in Florence, Italy, Daniel Graves at the Florence Academy. And he's got several branches now. I think one of them is in New Jersey or New York, and he's got one in Sweden. I believe it is Sweden, as well as in Florence, Italy. There's the Grand Central Academy in New York. That's, as I understand it, it was founded by Jacob Collins, who's a very good artist and a very good teacher. And there's several of the students of Richard Lack have started up teaching academies or ateliers in various parts of the world. In Minnesota, there's, I think, whatever was Atelier Lack has now been taken over by some of his former students. They're all good teachers. I'm sure they're good teachers. They're well taught, and there's a lot that one can learn from them. There's Jeffrey Mims in, where is he, North Carolina, I believe he is. There are actually quite a few now. And for those whose names I didn't mention because my memory is deficient at the moment, I apologize to them all. But there are some good teachers out there, but I would say judge by the quality of their work, for one thing. Don't study with somebody whose work does not inspire you when you look at it. Mm-hmm. If that's not the kind of work that moves you, that might not be the instructor to study with. And so don't pay any attention to degrees. A Master of Fine Arts degree, unfortunately, is a corruption of the word master. To include that in that degree, when they issue that degree to people who are not masters, it diminishes the validity of the term. It destroys the validity of the term master. And unfortunately, that's been the case throughout my entire lifetime. The college and university system has given Master of Fine Arts degrees to just about anybody, no matter how badly they've learned to draw or paint. Just if they've spent enough time taking the classes and doing the assignments and learning how to make good excuses for what they aren't very good at doing, they get a Master of Fine Arts degree. It is a worthless credential as far as I'm concerned. It's only good for getting a person a job teaching in the university system. And the qualification for getting that job being a credential rather than the actual quality of the work that a person is able to produce, it's just wrong. That's all. Now, I, strangely enough, got a job teaching for 3 years at a community college years ago. I don't have a Master of Fine Arts degree. I went to 4 different colleges taking art classes, and I dropped out of them all after 1 or 2 semesters because I was getting nothing out of it that was worthwhile. But somehow, people on the inside at this school wanted me to teach there, and they got one of the instructors who had pull strings to get me hired there. I lasted 3 years. But when I had my interview with the dean to determine whether or not they wanted to hire me, there were 2 deans there, 2 nice ladies, and they asked me questions, and I had answers at the ready for the questions. As you know, if somebody asks me a question about art, I can talk forever. And they were impressed with my answers. And then they stood up and reached out as if to shake my hand, as if, the interview was concluded and they had decided to hire me. And they hadn't once asked to look at any of my work. And I said, wait a minute, what the hell is this? I said, you haven't even seen whether I can draw or paint.
Wow.
You should never hire somebody without looking at his work. And they go, oh, yes. Of course we want to see your work. But I'm the one that gave them that idea. They were ready to hire me without ever looking at anything. That, for all they know, I couldn't draw at all. So I showed them my portfolio, and they seemed to be positively impressed, and I had the job. Whoopee. But they were going to hire me without knowing whether I could draw or paint, just on the basis of what I could talk. But a lot of people can talk a big game, and it's all talk, and there's not enough to back it up to make it really valid. But that's what's wrong with the university system, and it's still pretty much that way. So a degree is there is an expression. This is not of my origin, but somebody said this. In fact, a lot of people said this years ago, that a Master of Fine Arts degree is a certificate of incompetence. I won't say that that's universally true, but it's true in so many cases that somebody thought it was worth saying, and I don't disagree with it.
Wow, Virgil, I have a certificate of incompetence. The one that really cracks me up though is the doctorate. You can get your PhD in art. And what's a doctor of art or a doctor of fine art? I met a couple of doctors in my time who are, what's your doctorate in, or where'd you get your PhD in? Oh, art. Oh, okay. Well, it sometimes made me kind of chuckle to myself if ever there was a situation on an airplane where the captain comes over the loudspeaker. We have a situation. Is there a doctor on board? And one of these geese get up. Oh, I'm a doctor. What do you need? But no, I'm with you on that, mate. I'm with you.
I have something to tell you about that.
Yeah, go on.
While I was teaching at this college, whose name I won't mention, I had one student who had. Now, he was an elderly man, even older than I am right now. He had taught art for 35 years in the university system. He was the worst student that I had. Not only did he have a Master of Fine Arts degree, he also had a PhD in some art-related field, maybe several. I think art history and art education. A nice man. We became friends, but he could not copy a single angle correctly. He could not draw at all. His powers of observation had never been developed. And he acknowledged that there is something wrong with a system, because I suggested this. I asked him, I said, do you think there's something wrong with a system that allows a person to teach art for 35 years when he can't even draw the simplest subjects accurately? And he acknowledged, yes, there is something wrong with that system. This is the worst student I ever had as far as his talent was concerned. And he taught art in the university system for 35 years.
That's shocking, man. That is shocking.
Well, I hope I didn't insult you with my remark about the certificate of incompetence.
No, not at all. Again,
some people are exceptions to that, who do have a Master of Fine Arts degree and can still draw and paint reasonably well, but they didn't learn it in the university.
I agree 100%.
On their own somewhere else.
100%.
They did not learn how to draw and paint well in the colleges and universities. I can't think of a single person of which that is true, that they actually learned how to draw and paint by going to college and taking art classes. They learned it somewhere else, and they went to the college to get a degree.
I was raised by an artist, a fine artist. My father was a sculptor, still sculpts today, and he's getting on up there in years now. But he does realistic, life-size wildlife and animals, and he could not give a stuff about the art world or critics or galleries or anything. He does most of his work for zoos and museums, and primarily in the United States. and his viewers and the people that he's trying to impress and talk to with his art are children. So they'll go and see, the lion or the elephant, the elephant's child, or some gorillas, and they'll be playing all over his bronze sculptures. And he said that's who it's for. It's not for the critics. And I was raised by this guy, and he told me before I went in to do my degree, he said, remember, they will not teach you anything about art. You're already an artist, but when you go, just remember where you're going. You're going to just go and mix with some other people who might have similar values to you, and you're going for the social aspect. And so don't forget that. And he said, remember who you are and remember, what's important to you. And in precisely the same advice you gave that young man, years ago, you're going to hear some crap and just know it when you hear it. I did get my degree, but I must admit, there was a bit of damage done, and it wasn't until I became familiar with old masters' work. And I tell you, the paradigm shift for me came when I saw Carl Runge's paintings in the flesh and in books and reproductions. And I thought everything I was taught over those 3 years was crap. It was total crap. That's not important. Everybody's so busy trying to be different. Everybody's so busy trying to come up with the next groundbreaking idea that they're all doing the same stuff. And there's nothing there that is authentic, If you want to paint pretty pictures, then go and do it. And that's what I wanted to do. I was a landscape guy, and I just wanted to paint scenery and portraits, and what you see is what you get. You look at the landscape, you look at my painting, there's no question that it's a depiction of what you're seeing. And that's what really... So no offense at all taken. I think, Virgil, we're on the same wavelength, very much so, and I really appreciate your position. In fact, I'm getting a chuckle because it's like I'm hearing in you. You remind me a lot of my father, actually, in a lot of ways.
Well, he was a smart man. Listen to your father.
Yeah, he is.
He's probably younger than I am.
I think. Well, I don't know. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
73.
He's a little younger than you. Yeah. Only by a year, I think. No, I think you guys are cut from the same cloth, so to speak. But look, people will no doubt be screaming at their iPhone now, or watching this on YouTube, and they'll be wanting to know a little bit more about the technical aspects of painting. So I better cover some of that ground, and they'll say, why have you not asked Virgil about mediums and glazing and varnishing and all of this sort of thing? One of the things that I constantly am concerned with is when I'm painting in the studio, I'm worried, is this painting going to be around in 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years, in terms of are the materials just going to hold together, or is my paint going to peel off the canvas? Maybe you could talk us through some of the more tried, tested, and true ways to keep our paintings lasting a long time, because this is something that I'm personally really concerned with, is the longevity of the work. I want it to be here hundreds of years from now.
Well, there are several things that I can tell you that will help, or that would help if you were able to get the right materials. But they're harder to get, some of them, outside of the United States because of these overly restrictive nanny governments that want to protect everyone, no matter how stupid they might be. They don't want them to be able to suffer the consequences of foolish mistakes. And so they're trying to make the world so safe that no person will ever die of anything. And so they have outlawed the most permanent, or not outlawed, but made it very difficult to obtain the most long-lasting pigment that works in oil paints, and that is white lead, basic lead carbonate in linseed oil. The primary reason why the old masters' paintings still exist and we are able to see them in the museums looking as good as they do is because they painted with white lead as their white paint. They weren't using titanium white. They weren't using zinc white. They were using lead white. And lead is a unique element. It is more durable than just about any other substance. It is resistant to ultraviolet light. It has tremendous density, molecular density, and it has a slippery aspect to it, so that it lead carbonate, which is lead carbon and oxygen to create lead carbonate. Its molecule is such that it doesn't require a lot of oil to turn it into paint, because its nature is to be slippery. If you've ever handled any lead, you know it's got a slippery surface. And the best primer for an oil painting is white lead in linseed oil. And all the companies in Europe that supply artist canvas are using other types of primer. They're not using lead white anymore. All this concern for toxicity has really interfered with the availability of basic lead carbonate pigment.
Right.
So in the United States, there are still some sources of it, and there are still some companies that manufacture it. If you want me to name them,
please.
Okay. Natural Pigments still has white lead available, white lead oil paint, and several different varieties, and they're all excellent. Michael Harding, he's an Englishman who is a paint maker, an artist who makes paint. And he has recently opened, or within the last few years, opened a facility in the United States where he is making lead white oil paint and making, both he and Natural Pigments are making now stack process white lead, which is white lead oil paint made following the same manufacturing process that was in common usage in the 17th century and prior to that time, the times of Rembrandt. And they're also putting out lead carbonate that is made by modern pigment makers, which has smaller particle size. It too is excellent. And so you've got a variety of choices of lead white oil paint available. There's another company in New York called Vasari, Vasari, that has lead white. It has also a lead white oil ground for priming canvases or panels. Rublev is the brand that's put out by Natural Pigments. Williamsburg is another company that has white lead oil paint and white lead primer for oil paintings. There are some other companies too. The European companies are tending to phase out white lead because the source of the pigment that they used to get it from has ceased to provide it. And so there's one or two companies in the United States that still provide that pigment, but it's more expensive than the ones that the European manufacturers used to get it from. So they will sell it until they run out of the pigment, and then they'll probably phase it out altogether, or else they'll get it from an American supplier and raise the price into the stratosphere. Old Holland had some, and maybe they still have some. Winsor Newton had some. Maybe they still do. Blocks had it. Whether they still do or not, I'm not sure. Okay. Sennelier still has it. I don't know about the other manufacturers, European manufacturers. The zinc oxide quite often is added to titanium white without the manufacturer calling it anything but titanium white. You have to read the fine print on the tube if they've been conscientious enough to provide that information. But look for PW4. That's the symbol for zinc oxide, PW4.
Okay.
If that's there, don't use that paint. PW1 is basic lead carbonate. That's good. PW6 is titanium dioxide. It's okay, but it's not as good as lead white. Really, PW1 alone is the best. Now, PW1, lead white, can benefit from a small addition of titanium dioxide, but not zinc oxide.
Now, I'm just going to interrupt our podcast really quickly and we'll get right back to it. I had to let you know about something important. If you're not already subscribed through my website at www.andrewtischler.com/subscribe, you might be missing out on a bit of extra bonus content. My subscribers through my website get every video that I upload to YouTube 24 hours ahead of time, which gives them the opportunity to interact with me in that comment section down below. Also, my subscribers have access to some deals when it comes time to release my tutorials, like my upcoming landscape tutorial, as well as my portrait tutorial, which should be out before Christmas of 2018. Now, it's absolutely free to subscribe to my website. Please visit www.andrewtischler.com/subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you there. Find that. Let me ask you though, what are some of the dangers of using something like a titanium or a zinc? I mean, look, as a novice, I'm gonna call myself a novice here, but as somebody who's still very much learning the process of painting, I've got a long way to go still. I squeeze the titanium white. I can see a basic difference between the titanium and zinc. But what are some of the dangers that I'm likely to experience mixing that with my colors years down the track? I mean,
the danger is not to you, but to the longevity of your paintings.
Okay.
Zinc white should be avoided completely in any percentage. Zinc white becomes very brittle very quickly in oils, and it will cause your paintings to crack. It will cause your paintings to delaminate, the paint layers to separate from one another. There are several causes for this that are inherent in the molecule of zinc oxide. It's not a good pigment for oils. It's a good pigment to use in water-based media. That's what they use in watercolor that they call Chinese white. It's fine for water-based media. But when you put it in vegetable oils to make oil paint out of it, its worst characteristics manifest themselves in ways that will cause your painting to fall apart, crack, delaminate. Titanium white that has zinc oxide in it, this is true of that as well. Zinc oxide in no percentage that has been established yet with any degree of certainty can be regarded as safe in oil paints. Wow. That includes paints made with lead white that also have zinc oxide added to them. They also are prone to delamination. So it's best to avoid zinc oxide in oil paints completely. Titanium dioxide had zinc oxide added to it by a number of manufacturers before the full extent of the problems with zinc oxide were understood. And the addition of zinc white to zinc oxide, which is zinc white, to titanium white was to bolster the faults of titanium white. Titanium is a very lightweight metal. It's used in making racing cars and motorcycles because it doesn't weigh very much. And titanium dioxide is a white, fluffy powder. And it's one of those pigments that works very well in water-based media. Acrylics, watercolor, gouache, egg tempera. Mm-hmm. But mixed with oil, it makes a very weak paint film, very spongy, weak paint film. And it does not exhibit the drying tendency to oil paint that lead white does. Lead white acts as a dryer, and it adds physical strength to all the paints that are in the same ensemble with it, because there are bits of it. Lead soaps are formed when basic lead carbonate is mixed with vegetable oils. These lead soaps actually migrate through the paint layer and add physical strength and durability to all the paints in that whole painting. And if you've painted on a white lead ground, it has that effect also. So the reason the old masters paintings, the biggest reason the old masters paintings are still there is because they used white lead. They didn't use titanium white. If they had used titanium white or zinc white, their paintings would not have been possible to restore. They would have fallen apart, and we would have never been able to see them and be inspired by them. And why this is important is because for quality art, the kind of art that you and I appreciate, we want people to be able to appreciate that forever. Artists are the standard bearers for quality, as I see it. And we can create people create artworks that will inspire people to appreciate quality, understand what it is, and want to create it for themselves. We can only influence people with our paintings as long as our paintings actually exist. If they fall apart in 30 years or 35 years or 10 years, they're not going to inspire anybody beyond that period of time. So that's why it's important to be concerned if we're capable of painting paintings that will inspire anyone when they look at them. It's, I think, important to put them together with the best materials, the most durable materials we can find. Right. And lead white is the number one thing. Second of all, I would say avoid, if at all possible, painting on flexible supports. That means stretched canvas. Stretched canvas was adopted as an expedient during the Renaissance, possibly earlier even, when wealthy patrons, such as the church, had these huge cathedrals, or these wealthy dukes had these palaces, and they wanted huge paintings in there. And the artists were faced with a difficulty. How do we create panels in those dimensions that we can transport out the door of our studio and install in the cathedral or in the Duke's palace or the Pope's palace or King's palace? How do we do this when we don't have, Federal Express's trucks to deliver it in? We're having to deliver it by ox cart or by boat. So they realized stretching canvas on a framework of wood allows it, once it's finished, to be detached from its framework, rolled up, and delivered to its destination, and then it can be reattached to a framework of the proper dimensions there. And canvas was readily available in Venice, which is probably where this started, because that's a seaport, and canvas was used for sails of sailing ships. So that's where that came about. And people found its surface agreeable to paint on. It was different from painting on a panel, and it allowed you to paint a bit faster if you used the right kind of brush and a large quantity of paint. It gave some very pleasing effects that were not as natural when you're painting on smooth panel with soft hair brushes. Stiff bristle brushes work better with a canvas texture, and so on. So this is why canvas became popular, and then ultimately it became popular for smaller pictures as well, even though during the time of Rembrandt, a lot of artists still preferred to paint on wood panels for their smaller paintings, and they would only use canvas for large paintings, large commissions. But it's not ideal because oil paint becomes brittle. It loses its flexibility after X number of years. And when you have a layer of paint that is no longer flexible because it's no longer young, and it's on a flexible support that will expand and contract with changes in the humidity and temperature, or when someone opens a door, it creates a slight draft, the canvas is going to go like this. And if there's a rigid layer of paint on it that's brittle, it's going to crack. And when the surface of a painting cracks, then its integrity is interrupted then, and things that are in the air and applied to the surface can get below the surface. And they can get below the surface and start working to separate the layers of paint. Yeah. And so this is the beginning of the end of an artwork, an oil painting specifically, the life of an oil painting. And if it gets in the hands of good qualified conservators before it falls apart entirely, it can be rescued. But we can't anticipate the future and know that our paintings are going to fall into the right hands and be well cared for by the top level conservators of the future. They'll be in private collections in all likelihood for a long time before they get to a museum, if they ever get to a museum. And private collectors probably aren't going to want to hire the top level conservators. If their painting needs some restoration, they might just hire the cheapest guy. And if they hire the cheapest guy, that's not necessarily the one who's going to be doing a good job on it. And a lot of paintings have been screwed up by attempts at restoration by people who weren't the best. Let's put it that way. Nice way of saying it.
Mm.
So we're lucky that any of the paintings of the old masters survive, because conservation practices in centuries past are now recognized as being very problematic, and have caused a lot of problems, that some of which have been able to be undone by current level science, and some of them can't be. So we're lucky we get to see any of the old masters' paintings, and be influenced by the original impact that the artist imbued the paintings with. And we want to be able to do this. If we can paint paintings that will move people profoundly, we should want to put them together soundly enough and with good enough quality materials that they'll last for hundreds of years, just like the paintings that inspired us lasted for hundreds of years, so that we can inspire artists of the future. We don't know how long the paintings of Rembrandt are going to last, or Rubens, or Titian, or any of those. I mean, already I'm sure a lot of them have deteriorated beyond the point where they're suitable for exhibit. Some of them may be no longer in existence at all. We don't know how long they'll be able to hold together, how much they're going to change as a result of the ravages of time. So we've got to paint new paintings for the people of the future to appreciate, and to be reminded of what beauty is and what quality is. And when I speak of quality, I would like, if I'm writing it, I will use a capital Q when I use it in this context. The way Robert Pirsig, the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, used it. Quality is something that cannot be defined by words, but it's instantly recognizable. This is what we do with paintings. We will imbue them with quality that is instantly recognizable. This is the goal that I recognize as valid for an artist. Our paintings should not require a treatise of rhetoric to convince people that it's worth looking at, or that they should appreciate it, or that they should like it. The painting itself should give that impression. And the best works of art do that because they have quality. Now, a phrase that I coined myself years ago was intrinsic appeal, which is essentially the same thing as quality. And it's the same thing that was translated from the ancient Greek into virtue, which was not exactly a good translation of the Greek word for that. It was a bit misleading. But quality with the capital Q is probably a closer translation to that original Greek term that was translated into English. It makes a lot more sense that way. So that's something that an artist must develop an understanding of, and it cannot be conveyed verbally. That's just one of the things that goes beyond verbal and written language.
Well, in talking about a little bit more of this quality and preserving paintings for future generations, making sure that we imbue that work of art with as much as we can muster. One of the questions that I get a lot, and one of the things that I'm personally concerned with, is what we're adding to our paint physically, in order to give it a certain quality of either thickness or transparency or drying rate, mediums that we're adding to the paint. To change it in some way, I always get worried. I'm thinking, okay, am I going to run into issues with this binder years down the track, or am I going to, have this last pretty well? I had been using throughout my career Winsor Newton Liquin Original for a long time, alkyd resins, and then I've just recently started playing with more traditional types of mediums. But what personally do you use? What's some mediums that you like, given your work in painting?
Well, I've gone through everything over the years. I've been painting for a long, long time, about 60 years. So there's probably nothing I haven't tried. But what I'm using these days, people will be disappointed to hear it, but linseed oil.
Beautiful, beautiful. Is that stand oil or refined linseed, or what kind of linseed oil?
Well, this was flaxseed oil that I bought at the health food store in 1985, The brand name was Hain, Hain, and I treated it. I did water washing treatment, which is the main method of that was used in centuries past for purifying linseed oil. I've got the procedure explained in my book, but essentially it uses water. We would put 1/3 of the container, like a plastic soda bottle works well to do this. You put 1/3 water, 1/3 linseed oil, and 1/3 air, and you shake it up. Some people put sand in there, some people put salt in there. I don't think it's necessary to do any of that. You shake it up until it's a milky emulsion, and then you let it settle. And then the next day you shake it up again, for a minute or two each time until it's mixed and all cloudy, one substance. And then you let it settle again. You do this every day for 10 days, and then you just leave it alone. Put it on a windowsill and let it settle. Take the cap off and put some cheesecloth over the top to keep insects out of it. Put a rubber band on it to hold the cheesecloth on. And while it's settling, also the sun is shining in the window on it and giving it a bit of bleaching. Eventually, it will separate into 3 layers. The bottom layer will be water. The top layer will be the purified oil. Separating those two will be a layer of scum, which is the impurities, the water-soluble impurities that were in the linseed oil, mucilage, and possibly whatever was left over from the plants that it was squeezed out of. And then one way or another, you want to remove the refined oil from it without disturbing the layer of scum and without getting any water in it. And then you can expose this to the sun in a clear container like this, and that will give it a bit of sun bleaching. So that's what this is. This is what's left of a batch that I did in 1985. Wow. That'll give you an idea of how little of it that I use. As far as mediums go, really the less you add to your paint, the better it is. If you put too much fluid in with your paint, you're basically weakening the paint film that's going to result from it. Now, I use an analogy quite often with masonry. Now, if anyone understands masonry, they know that the strongest structure has the stones fitting closely together with very little mortar required to hold them in position. If you've got a structure that's made out of stones that don't fit well together and there's a lot of mortar in between them, that structure will not last as long as the one where the stones fit closely together. So if we were to take a razor blade and slice a paint film lengthwise and look at it with a microscope, the stones are the particles of pigment. That's the solid matter. And the medium and the binding oil, that's the mortar. So you can see how this analogy applies, I would think. If you've got too much medium in between these particles of solid matter, that's not a very strong paint film. That's a paint film that's going to crack more easily. That's going to develop problems because oil shrinks as it ages. That's one of the things. So you'll have what's called cleavage. As the oil shrinks, it loses physical volume, and eventually there will be cracks as the paint layer separates. This is what happens when people use too much medium. So I think there's too much reliance on medium. And the reason for it is that people are painting with paints that come out of tubes. And the manufacturers of these paints adulterate them with stabilizers to keep the oil from separating away from the pigment in the tube. And really, there's nothing wrong with it doing that. But people don't understand this, and they complain, oh, I opened the tube and nothing came out but oil. And so they put aluminum stearate or hydrogenated castor oil or some substance like that in there that will turn the oil into more of a colloid rather than a fluid, so that it won't migrate away from the particles of pigment, so it comes out like more like toothpaste or window putty or something like that. Well, that's not the right consistency that we need for controlling paint on our paintbrushes. So then people look for something to add to it to make it behave, to make it the right consistency. And then they're adding this medium and that medium to it, and people are placing too much importance on medium. Now, there is one oil painting brand that I know of that puts no stabilizer whatsoever in their paints, and that's Rublev. And the reason they do that is because I was the one who suggested it to them. And so they started doing that years ago, and it's worked out very well for them. So you can buy paints from Rublev. Natural Pigments is the company, that are paints that are as close as you can buy without having to grind them yourself to the paints that were used in the days of the old masters. And they're using pigments of varying particle size. They're using various configurations of oils, linseed or walnut oil. Some of them polymerized or what they call bodied oils. George O'Hanlon is the owner of that company and the chemist in charge of it. And he's a very astute researcher and a very conscientious manufacturer of paint. And yeah, I'm plugging his paint because it's paint that I encouraged him to make in the first place.
And is that what you're painting with?
Yes, primarily. If he were to make the full line of pigments, use the full line of pigments that I want to use, I would probably just use paint from his company, unless I could convince other companies also to dispense with the stabilizers. I don't want stabilizers in my paint. Aluminum stearate is soap. It's an ingredient in shampoo and things like that. It's not necessarily a good thing to mix with oil paint as far as how long that paint layer is going to last. It serves as a plasticizer, which is possibly a beneficial effect, but it also has potential for harmful effects as well. And these are just now starting to become discovered by paint chemists and conservation scientists. And I stay in contact with conservation scientists and paint chemists. These are some of my colleagues on the ASTM subcommittee for artist paints and materials, where I've been a member of that subcommittee for, over 20 years and an active participant. And I've come in contact with a lot of people who are extremely knowledgeable on those subjects through that subcommittee. And
I see.
I'm privy to information that a lot of artists aren't privy to. And so I want to bring that information to artists. This is why I wrote my book. And this is why I have my group on Facebook that's titled Traditional Oil Painting, same title as my book, to keep people up to date on the latest developments. Because anytime you write a book, it runs the risk of becoming dated anytime new information comes along. And so the longer a book has been in print, the more possible it is that something isn't right in it. And so I want to be able to update my readers. If I come across new information that says that something I wrote in my book was not correct, I want to be able to bring that information to them.
Sure.
I don't want to just continue to argue in favor of something I said 10, 20 years ago because I want to be right. I want to actually be right now, not 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Now, most of what I wrote in that book 10 years ago and before, the writing of that book covered a 22-year period. And most of what I wrote is still good and still valid. There are some changes I'll make to it once I come out with a revised edition. But the book's out of print now anyway. Used copies are still available through book searches, and generally the prices are pretty high, a lot higher than they were when the book was available from the publisher. But we'll see what's going to happen when I can get a reprint, or if that is, a new edition of it on the market. Whether it will be by the original publisher or another publisher remains to be seen at this point. But used copies of the book are available, and people who have the book and or are curious about these things can get good updated information based on current level of scientific knowledge on Facebook Traditional Oil Painting Group. And that's my group. I am the admin there, and I'm the major contributor to it. And so,
Well, I would like to just say, I mean, the book is excellent, but that Facebook group is fantastic as well. And I found myself, searching through the conversations and on the wall of that Facebook page. I mean, people are posting some really interesting questions, and you'll jump in there as a moderator, administrator, with your answers. And I found myself just using it constantly as a resource. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So I encourage everybody listening to this to jump on that Facebook page. Make sure you're following Virgil's page on traditional oil painting, because you will just learn so much. And I'm amazed as well because of the volume of information that's on there. You can have a specific question and just do a search on a keyword and find the conversation that's directly related to your exact question. I found that several times, so it's really cool to see. And I just hope you keep doing that, Virgil, because you're a wealth of knowledge and an absolute inspiration for artists like myself, and I know for the younger, up and coming artists as well.
well, I intend to do that. I made a promise to myself back in the 1960s when I became so disappointed is really too mild of a word. I became angry, infuriated by the fact that the colleges that I was taking art classes at were taking people's money under false pretenses. They were not only were they not teaching us how to do what we signed up to learn how to do, they were trying their best to discourage us from even pursuing that sort of thing. There was a very aggressive program of discouraging us from wanting to become good artists in a realistic manner. And of all the people that I took classes with, I'm the only one who was resistant to that, because I was already a good draftsman and a fairly good painter when I went there, but I wasn't as good as I wanted to be, and I foolishly thought that there would be someone there that could help me do it better. So I made a promise to myself when I finally realized I'm wasting my time and money at these institutions, and so are all these other people too. There is something so wrong about that situation. I have got to do something to change it. And so I promised to myself I would dedicate the time and energy to learning all the things that I needed to learn in order to be able to paint at a high level. And that once I got there, I would make sure that anybody who wanted to learn that, if people couldn't find someone else to teach it to them, I will teach them. And so many years later, I was teaching art. I was teaching a private class in 1985, and my students asked me one day, what book can you recommend that has everything in it that you're teaching us? And I said, well, there are a lot of books out there, but there's not a single one that I can recommend without reservation, because there's bad information in all of them. Or, yeah, actually, that's the truth. And so you're just as apt to be confused as you are to be helped by them. And they said, then you have to write one. And so then I realized, oh yeah, I made that promise to myself, back in the 1960s, and they're right, I do have to write one. And so that's when I started out writing my book. I didn't intend for it to take 22 years before I got it published, but that's the way it worked out, because once I start on a project, I want to do it as well as I possibly can, and that means doing a lot of research. And so I went to museums all over Europe when I could barely afford it, but I wanted to eyeball those paintings, my own eyes. This was before I needed these, and analyze those paintings and read everything I could read and pick the brains of the best artists I could find, talk to the paint manufacturers, get to know conservation scientists, learn everything I could from all of them, and so that I could make sure that what I wrote was just not another book with a lot of bad information in it, of which there are many, many on the market right now. So that's why it took me as long as it did to get it finished. And it was not a full-time project, because I'm not primarily a writer and nobody was paying me to do it. I am primarily an artist, and I had to earn a living besides writing the book.
I'm about to start a new series. I want to go traditional. I'm looking at the book. I'm also doing some research. I've got Massey's book and Mayer's book as well. You know, a bit of a blast from the past there. There were my mother's when she first started painting.
Whose books did you say?
Robert Massey, which was the
Oh, Massey. Okay, yeah,
formulas for painters, and then Mayer,
yeah,
which was
I've got it.
I think I've got the fourth edition of his artist materials book. Mayer.
I've got the book. I've read it,
Okay, so
and
I'm
I've
looking.
got Ralph Mayer's. You have to keep in mind all of these books come from a time when scientific knowledge was not as advanced as it is now,
Mm,
and so now we know that some of the things that they were saying were not good information.
okay,
They were thought to be good at that time, but they're not anymore. So they're not the last word.
okay,
If you want a book that is closer to up to date than Mark David Gottsegen's book,
okay.
The Painter's Handbook,
Mark David.
Gottsegen. I'll spell that when you're ready.
Yeah, go for it.
Gottsegen.
Great, Mark David
That's
Gottsigan.
and get the expanded and updated edition.
Okay,
It's published by Watson Guptill.
okay. Expanded plus updated. Great. Now,
His book is more recent than Ralph Mayer's, and so he had the benefit of uh, more recent science. And Mark Gottsigen was he died just a few years ago, but he was one of my ASTM colleagues. He was the chairman of the ASTM subcommittee on artist paints and materials. He was a very astute researcher,
mhm.
uh, and he was in contact with everybody, maintained good working relationships with everybody in the paint making industry and the materials testing industry and the conservation science industry. And the only time Mark is wrong about anything is when he disagreed with me, which was very seldom, to tell you the truth.
Well, look, I will look up that book. So I'm about to start a new series of works. I live in a really nice part of the South Island in country New Zealand, so I'm doing some on plein air and that sort of thing. Now I'm trying to move away from the liquid and alkyd resins. So I just want to go back to just plain linseed oil. I picked up a bottle of refined linseed oil, and I got a bottle of stand linseed oil, and I also got a bottle of pure gum turpentine. So I'm going simple, simple, simple. It mentions in your book that with stand oil, mix a little bit of turpentine in there to kind of get that stringiness to kind of break down, smooth it out, make it a little more homogeneous. I can't remember the exact
Yeah,
terminology.
that's information that I no longer feel is the best thing.
Okay,
These days, I'm painting with no solvent whatsoever.
great. Even for your underlayer, even for your base coat or toning the canvas, no solvent.
No solvent.
So what do you? So you're using that washed linseed oil and more of the
No,
oil.
no, I'm just spreading the paint on thinly by using a stiff hog bristle brush and pushing hard, spreading the paint out, and then if I want it to be thinner than that, then I'll take a brush like this and I'll stipple the surface until the paint is as thin as I want it to be.
Wow.
I'm not thinning the paint with solvent at all. If you thin the paint with solvent, you weaken the binding strength of the oil.
Okay.
And you wash some of the oil off of pigment particles. It sets up a situation where the likelihood of delamination is increased. For the optimal adhesion of oil paint to the primer, the ratio of oil to pigment as it comes out of the tube is about as perfect as you can get. And if you add anything to that to alter that, you're weakening the resulting strength of the film that's created.
Wow. Okay. I've got to because I've got a massive canvas, and my next commission is also I've got a commission work to finish off. Besides the work I want to do around here, it's 2.5 meters by 1.5 meters. Big Australian landscape. It's being shipped from New Zealand back over to Australia.
What are you painting it on?
Belgian linen, but it's been acrylic primed.
Well, that's probably better than oil primed if it's come from Europe, because all the canvases that come from Europe that are oil primed have zinc oxide in the priming. So acrylic primed is probably a better choice than that.
Okay.
So, and as far as, Belgian linen is good. Actually, polyester canvas is probably better from a longevity standpoint. But linen is considered the industry standard. So if it were me, I would glue it to a honeycomb aluminum panel so that it's rigid. I don't paint on stretched canvas anymore.
Okay.
I paint on rigid panels. Let me see if I can show you one right here.
Please, yeah. Are you sitting in a wheelchair?
Yeah,
That's awesome.
I like wheelchairs.
Well, I'm glad you can walk. That's I was just thinking, because I saw you move before. I thought, are you confined to a wheelchair? Jeez. No, okay, I see what you're doing there. Yeah, okay.
No, see, I prefer to work standing,
Yeah.
but since I got old and I've got a lot of back injuries, I can't work standing for as long as I used to.
Right.
And so the reason it's good to work standing is you can step back frequently and look at your work from a distance, and you'll spot whatever mistakes might be there more readily than you will if you're staying too close for too long.
Yeah.
So with a
Sure.
wheelchair, I can roll back and see my painting from a distance. I like wheelchairs.
Excellent.
Anyway, here's a painting I've been working on. I just
Okay.
started it. It's a commissioned portrait of a family. I don't know if you can see it or not. Can you?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's fantastic. Okay. Yeah, that's
It's,
better. That's better. Yeah.
It's lead primed linen, and it's glued and tacked to a rigid panel. This is the back of the panel.
What's the thickness of your ply that you've glued it to?
What's that?
What's the thickness of the plywood that you've glued it to?
It's pretty thin, but it's braced with basswood.
That's brilliant.
I think it's eighth of an inch plywood,
Okay.
or I'm not sure. John Annesley Company makes these for me. John Annesley Company in Healdsburg. John died recently, but his son is carrying on the work. And so this is a mahogany plywood, and the linen canvas is made for me by a man in New York. His name is Angel de la Cruz. Everybody says Angel, but he's Dominican, so he's a Spanish speaking man, and the Spanish pronunciation of Angel is Angel.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody calls him Angel except me. I call him Angel. But Angel de la Cruz at AE Art Canvas in New York.
Right.
He primes the canvas for me. I get that from him, and then I glue it to my panel. So I'm painting on a canvas, but it's on a rigid panel so that it won't crack.
Brilliant.
And it's primed with white lead, so it will have the maximum strength that an oil paint film can have. And here's, yesterday I put the base layer in for these flesh tones here, which that's just oil paint. It's mostly white lead oil paint, and it's tinted with a little bit of Mars yellow, a little bit of Mars brown, a little bit of Mars red, and a little bit of Mars black.
Okay.
And the reason I use the Mars colors is because they have a very high tinting strength. And so it's mostly lead white from a physical standpoint, but these high tinting strength colors mixed with the low tinting strength white lead means that it's very dense and very lean. And so you want your first layer to be lean. So this is essentially Rublev lead white number 1 that's just tinted with very small amounts of Mars colors, synthetic iron oxide colors. And I have prevailed upon George O'Hanlon at Natural Pigments to start putting out a line of Mars colors, his synthetic iron oxide colors, to supplement his line of, he's using all natural earth colors right now.
Excellent.
But actually, and the natural earth colors are good, but their tinting strength is lower than the synthetic iron oxides, the Mars colors.
Brilliant, brilliant.
I'm going to put this back on the easel. Sorry.
Yeah, please. No worries.
Okay.
That's a nice painting as well with, that looks like God with lightning bolts. Or is it Moses?
The story behind that is everybody thinks it's Moses. I should probably just call it Moses, but that wasn't what I had in mind when I painted it.
Okay.
Prior to painting that picture, I had painted several pictures, soft, sentimental, kind of moody scenes using beautiful women as models, posing in the moonlight, and things like that. And I realized people are going to think that's all I know how to paint. So I thought, okay, I need to swing the pendulum as far as I can in the other direction and paint the essence of masculinity. And so as I perceived it at that time, this was 1985, the essence of masculinity was power, the exercise of power. And so this is called Allegory of Power.
It's the alpha, isn't it? I mean, it's the alpha male.
And what I was, what I had in mind, who I had in mind when I did it was not Moses, but more like Merlin.
Oh, good. Yeah. Okay.
But I didn't want to festoon him with the goofy hat, and props and all that stuff that people put on wizards. I'm not Walt Disney. I wanted his body English and his facial expression to tell the story.
Sure.
So that's a composite of a model that I found and me.
Well, it's a really striking image. I just had a chance to see it as you were putting the painting back. That's great.
The instruction I gave to the model was I had him standing on a table, so I was looking up at him.
Yeah.
And I said, my wife made the costume for him. It wasn't that color. I changed the color of it when I painted it. But I said, you are like the conductor of an orchestra, but your orchestra is the elements of nature. You are controlling them with your great power, and you are enjoying the exercising of this power. And so that was the idea behind it.
Awesome.
But try to find some lead white.
Yeah.
And don't use anything with zinc white in it.
Sure. Yeah. No. Okay. I want.
And cut way back on the medium that you use. Try to add no more than is absolutely necessary to your paint to make it a controllable consistency.
So even when you're building up layers, because I normally do things like with a ground coat, like a block in, and then I do a modeling layer over the top and then detail. But what I want to move into is more a direct painting approach with lots of, who I'm really obsessed with at the moment, and actually one of my favorite artists of all time. I want to know how he did it. Jules Bastien Lepage. And he influenced the Glasgow Boys, and Guthrie, and the other names escape me.
You've got my book, right?
I do. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's a section in there there's at least a one page on the French academic method.
Okay.
That will describe the way that Bastien Lepage painted.
Fantastic. Okay, because that is just.
He was one of the French academic painters, and so they all work pretty much following the same procedures.
Yeah.
So there's the idea was developed first of all in thumbnail sketches, just what they call them esquisses or something like that, drawn from imagination on a very small scale.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would do, once they decided that this is the right composition, this will work, then they would pose models following the thumbnail sketch, and they would do studies. And maybe as many as they needed of all the particular elements in the picture, all the details that they felt were important. And then when they'd start on the canvas, it was pretty much the same as the Bouguereau method also, with maybe, Bouguereau did a few things his own way. But, and that's the method I'm following here too, by the way, on that picture that I just showed you that I got just started on. Then they would transfer the linear design, once it was worked out on a separate surface, they would transfer that to the canvas. And then they would strengthen it, like I have here, with either ink or some oil paint.
Right.
On a small brush. I don't know. Can you see this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I can see a very clear outline for the figures. I can see them perfectly.
After they got it on there in charcoal or pencil or whatever they used, then they'd go over that with a small brush with paint. And then from there, they would start filling in. This is probably, yeah, it is dry. Okay, good. Anyway, they'd start filling that in with general tones, fairly flat, for each area.
Great. Okay.
And when they'd have all the canvas covered with paint of the general color and the approximate value of each area, that stage of the painting is that's called the ébauche. And then they would go over that with the final stage is the fini. That's where they would refine it with glazes to deepen the darkest foreground darks. They would use scumbles. They would use opaque modeling to develop the forms until the finish. So that's the way Bastien Lepage worked, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Unless I kind of mixed up with someone else.
No, I think. Look, I mean, his work and there's a lot of distinct brush marks that look like it's almost Sargent-esque in a way, like John Singer.
Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I was confusing him with Lefebvre.
Okay, so Jules Bastien Lepage, he looked like
Bastien Lepage. Okay.
He
Lepage, however you want to pronounce it.
He looked like
I think he was probably more influenced by Millet and Corot, I think.
Yeah, so
he was
very direct.
What kind of subjects did he do mostly? More landscape?
No, so he was a 19th century painter, but he was concerned with like kind of farm life, peasant scenes. His most famous image facing you is of the potato gatherers, and there's a woman with a basket of potatoes, and it's kind of spilling out.
Okay, you're right.
And then there's somebody behind in the background, kind of picking and gathering potatoes, and it's a scene of.
I've seen it.
I can't remember. There's another one of a girl. And there's a man reclining behind her, just sleeping with his hat over his face. And she's just kind of got this bewildered, just dazed and confused look on her face, but she's just sitting there.
I know the painting. Yeah. I know the painting. I've seen it.
Excuse me.
I've seen it in person, I'm sure.
Yeah. So it's, I
think he painted fairly directly.
Direct. Yeah. So with my question would be then, with a direct approach, with some distinctive brush mark, a little bit of refining, what the method that you're talking about could still be used of mapping it out, of course, but then just having at it with a paint and a more of an alla prima approach. But
yeah, in the final layer, he would just work in a more painterly manner rather than trying to refine it with glazes and scumbles. In the final layer, he would be painting essentially opaquely and using large paint brushes and large quantities of paint so that he could retain that painterly aspect.
Yeah. So if I was to do what you're suggesting here, then how would a glaze work in that sense? Obviously your lighter colors are going to be scumbled in and brushed in dry, but let's say a dark glaze or a shadow glaze to do some toning or maybe create a three-dimensional effect. When you have to suspend a transparent pigment in a medium or an oil of some sort, how would you do that if you were trying to really limit the amount of fluid that you add to your paint?
If you use paints that are transparent by their nature, hang on a second. Let me get a color chart and show you something.
Okay.
Well, the color chart I was looking for, I think I have to climb a ladder to find it.
No
But
worries.
some colors are more transparent than others by nature. And I make color charts to kind of show up just how opaque or how transparent they are. So when I make these color charts, I'll spread the paint thickly on one side with a palette
If
knife.
you just
Can you
move
see
that
that?
way a little bit. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, good. I can see that. Yeah.
And I'll scrape it thinly on the other side. Now the paints that are more opaque, it'll look the same on both sides.
I see.
The paints that are more transparent, there'll be a distinct difference between the thick and the thin application. So you want to choose for your glazes paints that are more transparent by their very nature. You don't need to add a lot to them. Maybe you don't need to add anything to them. Just the binder that's already in the paint to make it into paint is sufficient. And then just spread it on thinly using a heavy, thick, stiff hog bristle brush. Mm-hmm. And then if what you've put on there is still too thick, wipe some of it out.
Okay, that makes sense. And then
but
when
you don't want to add a lot of stuff to your paint.
Okay.
The more stuff you add to your paint, the more you're placing the strength of the paint film in jeopardy.
Okay, that's interesting. Really interesting stuff.
You should, as far as glazing goes, in the style of Bastien Lepage, you would want to limit the glazing, if you used it at all, only to the darkest darks in the nearest foreground plane, because the optical effect that it creates is one of clarity, and clarity is only appropriate where there is not enough air in between our eyes and that surface to affect the way things appear. The more distance we look through, the more air we're looking through, and the air is not purely clear. It's actually a thin, transparent white during the daytime, because the sunshine, there are particles in it. There's physical substance to it, and that's why the distant trees look lighter and bluer than the same kind of trees up close. It's because of the air, atmospheric perspective, which I wrote about in my book.
Yeah.
The illusion of atmospheric perspective is destroyed if you use a glaze anywhere beyond the foreground plane.
I see.
Because it gives a degree of clarity that's inappropriate for that distance.
Sure.
So you would only want to use it on the darkest accents and the darkest shadows of the foreground plane. Otherwise, you're going to lose the image of three-dimensional depth to a certain extent.
Wonderful. No, that's great. Okay, look, I'm gonna squeeze in, just cram in here one more question. One more.
You ask me as many as you want. I set the whole day aside for this.
Oh, gee, I don't need all day.
It's up to you. Look, I want to help you as much as I can. Man, I made that promise. Remember, I made that promise to myself in 1968, 67 or 68, that I would help people. And you're the kind of person I want to help. So
look, Virgil, I got to tell you, when I've been very lucky in my career, because I've had you probably haven't seen much of my work, if any, but I mean, when I started painting, I came across the right people at the right time. So I'm exactly the same as you. I mean, I'm going to turn 35 this year, but I made that promise to myself when I had a few people come out and bend over backwards, want to do anything they could to help me. They saw this young kid, and when I first started my career, I was 19. I had my first exhibition, and I had there was one guy in particular who just, without even asking him, he just started dropping technical knowledge on me. And I said, if I have the opportunity to do the same for somebody else, I will do that. And now I actually do some coaching with some young people via Skype. My favorite little kid, he's 13. He's in Colorado, and I teach him free of charge. We do it all over the internet, and I talk to him about his painting. So I really appreciate that aspect to yourself and your character, because I that's how I want to be, and it's how I choose to live. So no, I appreciate that. But my question is, the final stages of this thing, once that's finished, and I know I can get some of this out of your book, but I'm struggling because I some paintings that I do for myself, I have the gift of having a lot of time. They can sit on the wall for months, even years, and I don't have to do anything because the client's not screaming for it. Whereas some of the time I've got clients who want them, or they'll say to me, "Hey, I've seen that painting. Is it available?" And they'll buy it. And so I've got a few different situations here, but in finishing it off and varnishing it, what I have been doing is I've been painting with an alkyd resin. It dries incredibly fast. Winsor & Newton have guaranteed like a permanent flexible structure. I haven't really seen any problems with Winsor & Newton liquid as such, but then I'll go over it with a retouch
Liquid's
varnish.
all right as long as you don't use too much of it.
Okay, so I've been using a retouch varnish over the top of that, and that works okay. And then I just ship it off and it's gone. But with a more longer lasting varnish after the painting's dried 6 to 12 months, you've got Damar, you've got all these other options. What do you use personally? What's your favorite varnish to use?
I have a varnish that's based on Regal Res, which is a synthetic resin that was recently made into a varnish by the conservation scientist René Delary, who works at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It's the same varnish that Gamblin has that they call Gamvar.
Okay.
And I don't know if you can get Gamblin products, but
Yes,
Gamvar is that. Also, Natural Pigments has that same varnish, a Regal Res varnish that they call Conservar, Conservar. And there's another company that has it. It's, let's see, Conservators Products Company. They call it UVS Finishing Varnish. And that's the one that I've been using, is UVS Finishing Varnish.
Okay.
But any of the Regal Res varnishes are the best you can get. Better than Damar. They were formulated to give all the best qualities of Damar, the desirable optical properties of it, without the yellowing and the brittleness and the need to remove it 30 or 40 years into the future. With Damar, you have to remove it and replace it because it eventually will turn brown. And right. And then there are what they call MSA varnishes that are acrylics that are soluble in mineral spirits. And Golden has some. Also, Liquitex has one called Soluvar. These are acrylics, and some people like them a lot. I've used them in the past. I don't think I want to use them again because Regal Res is better.
I think I'll use that one. I think I'll go with whatever you recommend.
If you can get a Regal Res varnish, I think that's the best you can do.
Well, I know I can get Gamvar. There's a company that would ship it to me that is based in Auckland, and they have all of Gamblin's products. So I know I can get Gamvar.
Gamvar is the one you should use, I think.
Okay.
And if you find trouble, some people say that they've had trouble with it beating up on the surface, and I had that happen on one painting too. Where that happens is when there was too much medium added to the paint when the painting was created.
Okay.
And the way to get around that is to make sure that the surface of the painting is perfectly clean and dry when you put the varnish on. And so the way to make sure that it's perfectly clean and dry is take a very soft cotton cloth, like an old-time diaper. Used to be people used cloth for a diaper, cotton cloth. Mm-hmm. Rather than these disposable things they use now. So if you can find a soft cotton cloth, moisten it with distilled water, very slightly, not much water. Wipe the whole surface of the painting very gently with that to remove all the water-soluble dirt that might have accumulated on the surface. Give it a day or two to completely dry so there's no water left on the surface or soaked into the paint. Then do the same thing with another soft cotton cloth, moistened very slightly with odorless mineral spirits. Go over it very lightly. If the paint is more than 6 months old, it won't come off with the mineral spirits.
Okay.
Odorless mineral spirits. Gamsol is a good brand for that. It's a very mild solvent. That will take off any of the oils that might have been on somebody's hand that touched it, or anything that didn't come off with the water will come off with the Gamsol. Then you let that evaporate for another day or two, and then you're ready to put your Gamvar varnish on, and it probably won't beat up if you've done that correctly.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. Great. So Gamvar, I've not used it. Is it pretty gloss, satin, matte? What kind of surface quality?
They have a satin version and a matte version and a gloss version, and I always use the gloss version because if you have dark passages in your painting, especially dark transparent passages with glazes, the matting agent that they put in there makes the cloudiness, and it destroys the depth or interferes with the depth of your darkest passages. So go with the gloss. And here's the way I reduce the gloss so that it's not overly reflective. After I have the painting lying flat when I put the varnish on, and I brush it on with a large, let's see, where's my varnishing brushes? Well, okay, I don't have it handy to show you, but I put it on with a brush about this wide, a hog bristle brush, stiff hog bristle brush, and I have 3 or 4 of them. And I use one to put the varnish on. Make sure that I cover it evenly so that there's no spots that I've missed. And then while that varnish is wet, I grab another brush that has no varnish on it, and I go over it with that to thin out the varnish that's already on the painting. And then I'll set that down and pick up another one and go over that with another dry brush so that I've made the layer of varnish as thin as possible. The thinner it is, really, the less glossy it will be, and the better it will be, because it doesn't need to be thick layer. It's better if it's a thin layer.
Perfect.
And so that reduces the gloss to a degree. Well, I mean, you can just keep doing that as long as you want to until the varnish is dry, and reduce the gloss as much as you want by following that method.
Listen, I've taken so much of your time. I really appreciate your spirit, your generosity here in sharing with me, some of these other things with oil painting and your views on art. It's been a lot of fun, Virgil. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, there's more information where that came from if you'd like to talk again.
Absolutely. No, I think this is definitely worthy of a few podcasts if you're up for it. Well, Virgil, thank you so much. I think you've given us so much information there. It's been amazing hearing your story and learning more about oil painting, and it certainly inspired me to look into this whole thing a little bit deeper. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and I'm honored that you consider me worth interviewing in the first place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How could I not? How could I not? Virgil Elliott, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll be speaking to you again very, very soon.
Okay, I look forward to seeing what you put together from all of this.
Now, thank you so much for watching and listening to this podcast. I really hope that you've enjoyed this conversation with Virgil Elliott. I know I got a ton out of this, and I really hope to have Virgil back on the podcast sometime soon. Now, as you heard, his book is currently out of print, but you may still be able to find some copies by doing a search on Amazon, and hopefully that book will be available for reprint sometime very, very soon. I know I refer to this book all the time in the studio, and I'm sure that if you find a copy, you'll do exactly the same and no doubt get loads of information from it. Now, if you liked this video, then hit that like button for me, and if you want to come back for more episodes of the Creative Endeavour podcast or some of my painting tutorials, then make sure you're subscribed to this channel. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook, but also make sure you're subscribed through my website at www.andrewtischler.com. Thanks so much for stopping by. I'll see you again soon.